Hi, I'm Jacek. I'm a lawyer working in the blockchain crypto space for almost 5 years now. For a few different projects, some of them should be called DeFi projects probably right now. And since the end of 2017, I'm a legal counsel at MakerDAO. I'd like you to say a few words about my perspective on the topic of the legal side of decentralized finance. This will be, like highly subjective, but at the same time, I'll try to convey some message about, my view on how that looks like when we are heading and what is important, what is relevant on a pretty high level. But I will try to provide at least some practical examples that might be useful. Now you know something about me, so let me learn something about you. I'd like to know who here thinks of him or herself as a person developing or building DeFi solutions, like products, protocols. Hands up. Okay, about a half. Who thinks that regulation is one of the major obstacles for development of DeFi as a movement? Okay, almost all. And the last question, are there any lawyers here in the room? Hands up. Just one, okay. So I'd like to start this presentation about, oh wait, that doesn't work properly. So let me start with a very general view on the topic, and I think that this topic can be divided into three things and some interconnections between them. So first of all, we can talk about the law. I mean, this is quite obvious. Also, we can talk about finance, which is decentralized finance, right? So let me start with building some connections between those three things. So we can present them on a triangle and explore these three relationships between each pair in the triangle. So first of all, law and finance. So many, especially in the crypto space, have a very simplistic view of law and finance, or of finance in general, as something that can exist in a totally pure form. A view that in the past there was something purely like pure economic activity, financial activity, free of any like legal overhead. Right? And this legal overhead appeared over time because of some regulation, because of the state, and so on. And this is, as I'm saying, simplistic and most likely oversimplistic, because the law and finance are actually much closer than many think. And just one example is, among many, is something that is called the legal theory of finance, proposed a few years ago by Katerina Pister from Columbia Law School. And here you can see a quote from her. The legal theory of finance asserts that finance is legally constructed. It does not stand outside the law. Financial assets are contracts, the value of which depends in large part on their legal vindication. So this is a very specific view of finance and law that always exist together as markets, of markets that are, both from public and like private perspective, always have like legal significance and always have legal structures in them. And of course, one may agree with such a theory or not, but when we look right now in the DeFi movement in blockchain in general, on what we call asset tokenization, we can see that it's actually quite true in many cases. I mean, when we are talking about, for example, tokenization of real estate, such as, tokenization of this building, at the end of the day, we want a token holder or whoever to have a legal claim on the part, of this stuff that is around us, right? A legal claim that can be enforced in real world. And this actually supports this view of the legal theory of finance, because we have like complex financial relationship that we are packing in new technology solutions. But at the end of the day, we need to have this legal component, which is very evident in especially in real asset tokenization. right. And the second relationship is decentralized finance. So really quickly about that, because that's being discussed over the past few days. So I think I totally agree that DeFi is hitting the world. I mean, this is one of the reasons why many of us are here right now. But yesterday evening on one of the meetups, Vinay Gupta like said a very wise thing, I think. Like he said that finance, finance will be like decentralized finance that works, right? That, this expression decentralized will have no meaning when we become mainstream, when it will become the best solution, the best existing solution, right? It will just become finance. So the question is, what is decentralization, and whether we are using this term to describe something that is, really decentralized. Or maybe, and I think that many people are coming to that conclusion right now, maybe it's more about values such as transparency or security, right? So we don't have products that are fully decentralized, but they are, decentralized to a certain extent, and they're fully transparent, which is, already quite a breakthrough in comparison to the mainstream finance. And I don't think that I need to convince you to that in reality we see a lot of different hybrid models which are partially decentralized for many reasons. Sometimes we have some technology constraints. We basically have no technology yet to deliver something that might be fully decentralized. Or sometimes, we have much simpler reasons. Sometimes people want to earn on their products, right? They want to apply certain business models. They want to have, central party that is earning money from running a certain product or service. And even though it is decentralized, there is this centralized component of a fee, for example. So one conclusion that is relevant for this presentation is that DeFi is quite a diverse and ambiguous phenomenon, right? So we cannot very often, we intuitively see many commonalities across all the DeFi movement, but at the same time, there are a lot of differences in how these projects and products and protocols that are being built are structured, because they are decentralized to a certain degree, depending on a given product. And lastly, the third pair in this triangle is decentralization and the law, so something that is most interesting for me, to be honest. And here, one thing that I want to say about is that, decentralization, we are, talking about this word all the time. It has a very particular meaning. At the same time, everyone, I think, has his or her own understanding on what does it actually mean to be decentralized. And the question is that, decentralization something that we, understand, something that we support? Is that something recognized by the legal system? And of course, that is a very theoretical question. But the simple answer is that we don't have a legal concept of decentralization. We see that emerging in some fields. So in academia, we see the first papers on the topic. And also we see that in practice. I'm sure that many of you have heard about so-called Hinman test, the guy that said from the SEC that Ether is likely not a security now, because it is sufficiently decentralized, right? So he introduced in practice this concept in a very practical legal problem, whether a certain thing is a security or not. Solution is, it's not because it's sufficiently decentralized, but what does it actually mean, right? And also, this is a problem that is very often being considered in securities law right now, but it's actually quite the same across many legal fields. And one very concrete example is here in Europe is GDPR, because this is a type of regulation that was aimed to be, it was thought to be technologically neutral from the very beginning, but at the same time, it does not respond well to decentralization, right? It basically is about regulation of central or centralized personal data controllers, right? And it's really difficult to apply this regulation in the context of decentralized networks. So now when we talk about these relationships between decentralization law and finance, let me talk about a few legal issues that seem to me most relevant. That might be a bit philosophical or abstract, but I will try to provide some examples of why it's relevant for the DeFi movement. So the legal issues are as follows: responsibility, jurisdiction, sovereign, or rather lack of sovereign, legal personality, and the fifth point is some other legal challenges that I would briefly talk about at the end. So first, responsibility. I think that this is, a core problem that we are facing right now across all the, legal fields, across all the areas of finance, basically everywhere where DeFi solutions are present. This directly follows from this decentralization premise. So if something is decentralized, who's responsible for running it? This is the basic question that lawyers are asking themselves, that regulators are asking themselves, and we see first answers that are being provided. Not so satisfactory so far, but that is the largest legal problem that we as a DeFi movement are facing right now. And here, to see how practical it is, you have the very first article, the very first provision of MiFID II, which is in Europe, in the EU, is like a cornerstone of financial regulation, right? Equivalent to Securities Exchange Act in the US, like defining a lot of, basically providing, basic regulation of financial services in Europe. As you can see, this provision says that this directive shall apply to centralized entities A, centralized entities B, centralized entities C, and centralized entities D, right? This is a very specific method of regulation that we see everywhere, right? That, even though theoretically speaking, we know that we shouldn't regulate banks, we should regulate banking, the, prevailing method of regulation is that certain entities are being regulated, right? And now everyone, like each DeFi project that is developing something in a decentralized environment that these guys are doing, needs to face the question whether this regulation applies to them, right? Because I can provide some investment services without a centralized provider, and how this type of regulation apply to me, right? And even if we come to a conclusion, in a good faith that there is no centralized provider, but I want to comply with the law, these laws are not adjusted well to decentralized networks, right? Because the basic assumption here is that there is a centralized entity that is doing something and is regulated. So that's, as I said, the largest issue or challenge that we are facing of finding a solution for that. The second legal issue is about jurisdiction. At the beginning of the 90s, so 30 years ago, with the beginnings of the internet, there were quite a few interesting legal theories of cyberspace as a separate jurisdiction, right? As we all know, it didn't work out I think for many reasons, but one is really significant here, is that all the firms like Google, Amazon, Facebook, all these big companies, they operate in the internet, like in the global network, but at the same time they are based in certain jurisdictions, right? You can easily define where this company is based in terms of jurisdiction. They have multiple companies across the whole world, and we can easily, or more or less easily, define who's responsible for doing something. And now, the blockchain brings this question again, whether we don't have something separate, like something that's separate from existing jurisdictions. And I know a few lawyers who are, openly supporting the view that blockchain, like permissionless blockchains, are actually separate jurisdictions, right? This sounds like a very theoretical problem, but from the perspective of DeFi projects who are building products that are global, right? Which do not know any borders, which can be, used by anyone in the world. It's actually quite confusing to find itself in this legal world of huge area of land divided in plots and divided by huge fences. This is how lawyers look at the world, as as a like many different jurisdictions. You're moving to another country, you are under another set of laws, right? And here, if you are building a global product, a decentralized financial service that is available to anyone in the world, it's really difficult to comply with the laws in each of these jurisdictions, right? And so far, we've seen a lot of successful crypto projects that just didn't care about that just were providing their services everywhere without caring about local circumstances. But that's becoming more and more challenging. With the rising significance of what we are doing and with rising awareness of regulators, this is becoming challenging. And this is a huge threat, right? Because we see that at the moment that people are in a DeFi movement, something that was meant to be open, decentralized, are behaving like in this old world, right? Directing their products and services to certain jurisdictions only, limiting to a large extent, the technology the possibilities that technology is giving us. The third legal challenge is about sovereign, or as I said, lack of sovereign. So. This is quite interesting, from the legal perspective. That you may think about this as a lender of last resort in economic terms, right? In traditional finance, you always have this central bank that can do something, right? That can provide last chance liquidity to anyone, right? We don't have that in the decentralized world, but at the same time, we don't have this legal sovereign that can do whatever they want with the existing reality, right? This is very significant from their perspective, right? Because they, like sovereigns, like states, their agencies, they are not used to a situation in which they cannot, force someone to reverse a transaction or force someone to close a product, right? This is very small but a significant change. That even if you, find this responsible party, put them into the jail, for example, developer, this product still runs, right? Because it's being deployed on the decentralized networks, it just exists, it just provides services, right? So this is something that, like in extreme scenario, that leads us to a complete clash with the existing regime, where there exists this sovereign that is used to its power, right? So we need to somehow find ourselves in this situation and try to, somehow solve that problem, right? Because otherwise, DeFi will be real difficult for us to become this mainstream finance if we don't solve this particular problem. The fourth challenge, the last so abstract one, is about legal personality. I think that it's totally underestimated right now. It's not, at least in my opinion, it's not a coincidence that the development of capitalism 400 years ago was combined to a large extent with development of companies, corporations, legal persons. And when you think about that, legal person company this is not something that exists in the real world, right? This is something that exists in our, social imagination, that we are thinking about, I don't know, Google as a concrete player, right? But what is Google? I mean, outside that, this is a group of people that have, some buildings, technology, like they are offering some products. These are legal entities. We are thinking about them as something that exists. And also, when you think about finance, looked at one of the reasons why bankers or other individuals in the financial world are not being held accountable for what they are doing, is that basically what the main entities in the financial world are legal entities, right? They are so widely used. This is not just because banks or insurers or stock exchanges are structured as legal entities, but these legal entities are used everywhere. I mean, for example, securitization, this is a type of a business that uses a lot of legal entities, special purpose vehicles, right? This is basically, this shows like strong interconnections between law and finance in the existing mainstream financial world, right? And we need somehow to find ourselves in this reality, because, you know, our products in DeFi movement, they do not use legal entities, right? We use smart contracts, we use DAOs, right, which provide the same goals, right? They're quite similar because they also do not exist in the real world, but at the same time, we're using technology to run it, right, to achieve the same goals. But this type of, you know, let's say entities, smart contracts that are completely autonomous, they are not recognized by the current legal system, right? They're not existent to a large extent, right? So unless we solve this particular puzzle, and we see quite a lot of interesting ideas of, you know, extending the scope of legal personality to cover such a, you know, new mechanism, such as certain smart contracts. Unless we solve it, we will see a lot of problems of expanding further as DeFi. And now we have, of course, many other legal challenges. Here I listed just three that seem to me particularly relevant for Europe right now. Much more concrete than what I was talking previously. The first one is especially relevant for secondary security token exchanges, right, that we see popping up everywhere, also those decentralized. So we have in the EU, and in principle, a mandatory use of central securities depositories. This is something very, like, coming from very old financial world, basically with like a concept of trade and settlement like existing on a completely different layers, right? And we have special entities, such depositories, which are responsible for this settlement layer. But here in blockchain, you know, we are to some extent solving or completely solving this problem, because, you know, like, blockchain is providing us with a possibility to do a trade with, you know, flat automatic settlement. I mean, this like settlement and trade are becoming really close to each other, right? We don't have any specific entity that would take care of just settlement, right? Which would take 2 days, for example, as it takes place in traditional finance right now. But at the same time, this type of structure is now petrified in the laws, right? So you need to use these entities in order to provide the services if you want to comply with the law, right? So this is a very specific legal problem that is quite common across the EU, and, you know, we need that to be somehow solved before we are able to provide such services that would be recognized by the traditional finance. Second, in a few countries, including Germany, we have the concept of paper-based securities. This is an extremely interesting topic, a very long one. It's perhaps difficult to understand, but basically, you know, these regulations provide that at the end of the day, you know, we have like many institutions, but at the very end, there is a certain safe box in a certain institutions that contains a paper, and this paper is this actual security, right? And this leads to many problems with actually, you know, digitizing stuff. For example, using tokenization, right? Because you have this, you know, this paper certificate that is actual security, and if you create something digital, it's not legally the same. I mean, you can get really close, but it won't be the same. And the third very specific problem, it's being talked about by Melonport and other people in the fund industry right now. It's about custody of investment fund assets. You have certain requirements that relate to this custody, right? That need to be exercised by certain parties. But, you know, in the crypto world, you have a concept of self-custody. You can, you know, be your own custodian. You can hold your private keys and be responsible for your own assets, right? And that's, again, this is quite similar to the first point here. Again, it's a, you know, problem in existing regulations that are petrifying the old approach, right? And need to be open in order to really, you know, like free up possibilities and opportunities that are being created by the DeFi movement. And now, just a few words about some solutions or maybe recommendations from my side. So one thing is that no strategy will work for everyone. We are coming from so many different backgrounds, areas, like stable coins, lending, derivatives, securities trading. These are, of course, interconnected, but separate fields. And we are applying various solutions. We are building, various business models. Using different technology solutions, right? So, I think that each DeFi projects here should use their own strategy, develop their own strategy. The second thing is that we shouldn't be cheating ourselves and think about ourselves as, we are building something decentralized and we just cannot care. We shouldn't care because nothing applies to us, right? To a certain degree, that's true, right? Decentralization, even though it's not a consistent legal concept anymore yet, it provides some degree of legal defense, right? Because we can claim that we are different than all these others, so we should be treated differently, right? But at the same time, as I said at the beginning, we hardly see any completely decentralized projects. Usually, that's about certain degree of decentralization and centralization in various proportions, and we need to manage that carefully, right? Because depending on this type of management, you'll potentially come to different legal conclusions. So that's about measuring the risk involved in your particular projects. At the same time, I think that we should still stand firm in our principles, right? I think that we all can agree that we are building, something new, something that, did not exist before, right? That have certain principles and values of openness, decentralization, transparency, security, right? And we need to stand firm in these principles. That I mentioned that I think that even if you're creating something completely crazy and decentralized, it's quite good to have a regulatory strategy in the current environment that has changed a lot over the past 2 years. And sometimes some of the projects are like I cannot fly under the radar anymore. They are just too much money is at stake to avoid interest, right, from the regulators. So I recommend that in that case, of course, that's not legal advice whatsoever, but I recommend that in that case, you may want to go to your local regulator. Even if you are not regulated at the moment, these guys, they like to have things under control or think that they have things under control. And actually, you can get a lot of value from that, right? You can really, that's not about, very often these guys are not about, just punishing. They are there, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, and quite often to help. And also my last recommendation, perhaps the most important one from my perspective, is that look for other projects which have similar challenges. I love that we can call a DeFi and use the word movement, right? Like that has a certain direction and common goals. And our voice is like, it's badly needed. Yesterday I arrived here late for this conference because I was in the European Commission, and I can say our voice is badly needed right now. So my dream is to, here specifically in Europe, to come up with something that that is just a working name. I called it DeFi Europe because this voice needs to be heard. We will be strong as a group, and even though we have some diverse backgrounds and we are building different projects, we have these common principles and very often very similar legal problems that we need to solve, and we'll be stronger as a group rather than individual projects. That's the end. Thanks. Any questions?
Hey, We don't have time for questions right now. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact the lecturer.
I am around, so I think that's not a problem.
Thank you.